Okay, so I'm gonna slightly break this novel up a little bit to talk about the different elements of it. I'm actually gonna be using the three husbands as kind of the three linchpins of this novel, the three kind of major points that it's easy to. They kind of represent three major moments in Janie's life. But before we kind of go into looking at those, I think it's really worth considering how this novel is narrated. Where do we get this story from? So if we go very, very beginning, very first page, chapter 1, we have this strong two opening paragraphs, which I'll just read out for you now. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some they come in with the tide, for others they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eye away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. Now, women forget all those things they don't want to remember, and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth. Then they act, and they do things accordingly. So the beginning of this was a woman, and she had come back from burying the dead. Okay, so who is speaking here? Okay, we have a third person narration, yes. But who's our kind of perspective character? Whose opinion is this coming through? We set up right in those first two paragraphs that we are talking about a female narrative. Okay, this is what men is. This is the life of men. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. And that kind of feels like a nice generalization about every man's wish on board, and that phrase of every man is a very common one to kind of just mean everybody. But then she comes in with that second paragraph and goes, women forget all these things. This isn't the story of men. Oh, that all men that you've been thinking about. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about women's experience here. We see Janie from the outside in this first section. A woman. The beginning of this was a woman. Fantastic, almost kind of biblical opening line. The beginning of this was a woman. She'd come back from burying the dead. So we start with a woman and we start with death. But who are we looking at? Whose eyes? The people all saw her come. This is just the fourth paragraph. It was the time for sitting on porches beside the road, a time to hear things and talk. Sitters have been tongueless, earless, eyeless all day long. Mules and other brutes had occupied their skins, but now the sun and the boston were gone. They became lords of sounds and lesser things. They passed nations through their mouths. They sat in judgment. We have a judgment. We have a town of people who are watching her. We don't even know her name yet, but this is Janie. We're seeing her. We have a frame narrative here, so we're seeing her at the end of her story. She comes back from burying the dead. She is exhausted and miserable, and she's still incredibly beautiful. She is sad because she's just buried. Who we're gonna find out. It's Tea Cake. It's her kind of her lover. He's her third husband, which we kind of use this phrase, although I'll say that's complicated to say. We know that she's a 40-year-old woman, but she's got her hair swinging down her back like a young girl, so she's not behaving the way she should be. This is a woman, and the judgment of the world, I think, is interesting, but we see this from the outside. Our perspective character who kind of comes in here is Phoebe Watson. She's kind of our representative of the town. She's the one, she's an old friend of Janie, so she goes to see her, she goes to talk to her. It's her kind of, it's her comments on Janie, it's her, she's the kind of the crucial person here. And if we kind of compare this with right at the very, very end of the book, when we finally return to this frame narrative, and there's no popping back into it at any point, it's just Janie's story, and many times that is long narratives of her grandmother's narrative, various other people kind of telling their stories, the guys on the porch, all of these kind of episodes that come through Janie's telling of the story. But right at the very, very end, the last chapter continues the story. It tells about her kind of her leaving and kind of deciding to come back to Edenville. In chapter 20, kind of the first page or so, I'm not quite sure which editions you've all got, but it's 191 in my edition, which is this one here, the Harper Perennial edition. Suddenly we kind of cut back to Phoebe all of a sudden, and Janie says, "Now that's how everything was, Phoebe, just like I told you." And I've put this line back. I've put this line up on the slides here, because she says, "I know all them sitters and talkers going to worry their guts into fiddle strings till they find out what we've been talking about. That's all right, Phoebe. Tell them." Janie says, I know everyone's talking about me. I know they think I'm interesting and peculiar. Well, fine. I've told you my story. You tell it on. And that becomes really key to the story when we think about Zora as a sort of an anthropologist, in the way that she collected these folk stories, the kind of a social historian who is documenting what people talk about. Is this Janie's story, or is this Janie's story as people tell it? And that is something that we can see in actually, a lot of kind of black folk writers. And if you think of somebody like Toni Morrison, actually, particularly with the novels like Sula, which is fantastic and really sort of strongly recommended. It's not so much Sula's story as the story of Sula told by the town. It acquires mythic proportions. People start to say, Sula arrived in a plague of robins. These magnificent gestures that can't be real, and things are slightly larger than life. A kind of Southern Gothic that kind of comes in here. There's a similar vibe to this. There's a similar, everything is slightly told. It's slightly story-like. And so I think that becomes an interesting way of looking at life, is the idea to depict life as we actually experience it, or as we remember it. And who is the we that is remembering it? Is it an individual, or is it the culture? So we'll look, we'll move from there on to looking at the first kind of stage of Janie's life. And this really ties into the notions of cultural history and cultural roots, because we have her grandmother, a very significant figure at the beginning, Nanny. Nanny is a former slave. So this is where we do engage with the, with the history of slavery of the black people in America, and Nanny gives her story chapter 2. So chapter 1 is basically Jenny and Phoebe, but then chapter 2 we kind of get Janie's growing up, and notice the image of the tree. The tree keeps coming through. Chapter 2, it starts the chapter, Janie saw her life like a great tree and leaf, with things that suffered, things enjoyed, things done and undone. Dawn and doom was in the branches. We keep coming back to that image of the tree, and that it's a very striking vision that she has in this chapter, where she sees this beautiful tree, sort of full of bloom, full of blossom, and says, this is life, its beauty and its glory. So it's page 10 in my chapter. It's in my copy. It's about second or third page of the chapter. it's a blossoming pear tree, which is, images. I mean, blossom is very much kind of associated with innocence, and fruit with a kind of fertility. This is life and options and everything that is available, that is everything the world has to offer is beautiful. From barren brown stems to glistening leaf buds, from the leaf buds to snowy virginity of bloom, it stirred her tremendously. She has this kind of epiphany of life and glory, and in a sense that is the thing she's trying to hold on to throughout this entire novel. She keeps thinking back to it, and as she kind of moves through the different phases, I think she does get close to it eventually, but she has to move through different kind of versions of being before she gets to that. The next page, it says, "Oh, to be a pear tree, to be any tree in bloom, with kissing bees singing the beginning of the world." And then this nice young boy comes along, Johnny Taylor, and she kisses him, and the sort of the joy and liberty of this moment, she just feels so happy. She kisses this handsome young boy. Lovely. But her nanny sees this, comes out, nanny being her grandmother, sees this, runs out and says, look, you can't do this. No, you're not to be fooling around with that boy. And her grandmother arranges her marriage to Killicks. Killicks is the first husband. And really tied up with all of the Killicks story is Nanny's story. And Nanny tells, through this chapter, Nanny tells her own story. She tells of, this is great, page 16 in my copy. Nanny says, "I wanted to preach a great sermon about coloured women sitting on high, but there wasn't no pulpit for me." She has a similar vision of what it is to be a coloured woman, and that her story is entirely about saving Janie. Because she tells her past. She tells about her time in slavery. She tells about having the child of the master, and then the mistress being furious with her. She tells about how she tried to save her daughter, about the tragedy that her daughter was raped, and then how she tries to save Janie. And she kind of says, "Look, I've done all this. I've suffered. I have saved. I've worked so hard for your future. So you have to not throw it away with that handsome young boy that you kissed under the blossom tree. You need to go and marry this man Killicks, because he is sensible. He's got a little bit of money. Take care of me." The final line of this chapter is, "Put me down easy, I'm a broken plate." I'm a cracked plate, sorry, it is. And there is a sense that this is history dominating the present. This is Nanny saying, you have to do this for me. I need to see you okay. And this is Nanny's version of okay. So she never particularly loves Logan Killick. She never particularly, there's no kind of romance there. He says lovely things, and for a while that's quite nice, but she pretty quickly, she realizes that kind of romance just goes, and she gets married, and then she this, towards the end of that chapter, she's standing around waiting for the blossom. She knows blossoming is going to come again, but she has this feeling of expecting that what she has currently isn't sufficient. She sees the romance die. It's a kind of, this marriage isn't happy. It isn't doing anything for her. And he kind of puts her to work. He makes her work, just around the house, where picking potatoes and so on. She's kind of working for him. She is essentially a slave in so far as she does not have any liberty. She has no liberty to do what she wants, to go where she wants. And so the heritage that Nanny has given her is one of restriction and restraint. And so it's not surprising that, you know, one day Joe Starks comes along, and he's our kind of the second husband, and she goes, oh, all this feeling of expecting, of waiting, this is what I've been waiting for. And so she runs off with him. And Killicks and the history and the, you know, doing good by Nanny, and Nanny has died by this time, that is all sort of swept away. She's not gonna pick potatoes for somebody else. She's not gonna work hard. And what is interesting is that, you know, Joe kind of seduces her away from that, going, no, you're not meant to be doing all this hard work. But by the time that she ultimately is happy, she realizes she is happy to work. She can work hard. It's not that she shouldn't be doing this, but she should be choosing to do this, because ultimately she does, you know, work in the Everglades with tea cake. She's you know, really happy to just kind of, you know, get herself dirty, get herself exhausted, you know, go through all of that suffering. But she's going to choose to do it. And with Killicks, she doesn't get to choose. So that is kind of the first part of her story. It is the past, it is repression, and that is something that Janie as a character is just walking away from. She is not accepting the history that Nanny gives her. She's saying, no, life, possibility, blossom, it's out there. I'm gonna go get it. Okay, next up, Joe Starks, episode 2 of this wonderful novel.